10,000 years ago, if you tried to tell a group of humans that you were their king and deserved the best cut of meat just for existing, they probably would have laughed in your face. Or, more likely, they would have waited until you were fast asleep and hit you with a heavy rock. For about 95% of human history, we lived in what experts call fierce egalitarianism. Having a boss wasn't just annoying back then, it was actually considered a kind of mental illness or a serious moral failure. If you tried to boss people around, you were seen as a direct threat to the safety and survival of the entire group. This is the story of how we traded that absolute freedom for the most successful protection racket in history. We're going back to the moment the first fence was built and the first grain silo was filled, because that's where the idea of the king was born. It's not just about crowns and gold, it's about a massive psychological shift that changed what it means to be human at our very core. We're looking at the exact moment a big man with a club turned into a divine king with a standing army, and the weird biological trick they used to make us obey without a fight. By the time we're done, you're going to understand the hidden contract we all still live under today, even in modern democracies. If you leave now, you'll miss the surplus trap, the one historical mistake that made it impossible for us to ever go back to being truly free. Welcome back to Showing Wild Fights. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is going to change how you look at every leader on the planet. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the deep dives we have coming up next. For most of our time on this planet, humans lived in small, tight-knit bands of about 30 to 50 people. We were nomadic, always moving, always following the seasonal food sources. In that world, hoarding was physically impossible. You couldn't own more than you could carry on your back while trekking through the brush. If you found a honey tree or killed a zebra, you shared it immediately. Not because you were a saint, but because you didn't have a fridge. If you didn't share your meat today, your neighbor wouldn't share theirs next week when you came home empty-handed and starving. Sharing wasn't just a nice thing to do, it was our primary insurance policy. It was the only way to survive in a world where nature was constantly trying to kill you. Anthropologists have spent decades studying groups like the Kung people of the Kalahari Desert to understand this ancient way of life. They found something called reverse dominance hierarchies. Basically, the group worked together to make sure no one person got too much power or a big head. If a hunter brought down a massive giraffe and started acting like he was the man, the rest of the tribe would use a technique called shaming the meat. They would sit around the fire and talk about how skinny and pathetic the animal was, even if it was a prize kill. They'd joke that there wasn't enough fat on the bones to feed a small bird. They did this specifically to keep the hunter's ego in check. They knew that pride was the first step towards someone trying to be a boss, and in their world, a boss was a liability. There's a famous story about an anthropologist named Richard Lee who lived with a tribe in the 1960s. To thank them for their hospitality after a year of study, he bought the biggest, fattest ox he could find for a massive Christmas feast. He expected them to be thrilled and to praise him for his generosity. Instead, they spent days telling him the ox was a bag of bones and that everyone would go hungry because of his poor choice. He was devastated and confused until he realized they were doing it to him too. They were keeping him level. In the Stone Age, if you didn't stay level with everyone else, you were considered dangerous. If someone didn't take the hint and kept acting like a bully or a leader, the group would collectively decide to exile them or, in extreme cases, execute them while they slept. This kept us equal for hundreds of thousands of years. We lived within Dunbar's number, the idea that you can only really know and trust about 150 people. As long as everyone knew everyone, you couldn't lie or manipulate your way to the top. But then the world changed in a way no one could have predicted. About 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, the climate stabilized, and the weather became predictable. Humans in places like the Fertile Crescent started noticing that if they stayed in one place and threw some seeds on the ground, food would grow in abundance. This was the agricultural revolution, and it was the beginning of the end for our ancient freedom. You see, you can't tax a hunter-gatherer. If you try to take their berries or their meat, they just walk 20 miles into the woods and you never see them again. But once you plant a field of wheat, you're stuck. You can't move your farm. You've invested months of sweat and hard labor into that soil. You're anchored to the land, and that makes you a target. This created the surplus problem. For the first time ever in human history, people had more food than they could eat in a single day. We had to store it to survive the winter. We built the first grain silos, and that's where the first kings really started to grow, like weeds in a garden. Think about it. If you have a giant pile of grain, you need someone to guard it from neighboring tribes who might be hungry and want to steal it. You also need someone to decide how much grain everyone gets during the lean months. But wait, the craziest part is still ahead. The first people to do this weren't kings. They were more like middle managers. They were the guys who offered to keep track of the piles and make sure the math added up. If you think your boss today would have survived a week in the Stone Age without a human resources department to protect them from the rest of the tribe, drop a "no" in the comments. And hit that subscribe button if you're glad we don't solve office politics with sharpened spears anymore. It's wild to think that our ancestors would have seen a modern CEO as a literal villain or a person who had lost their mind. As settlements grew from tiny villages into the first real cities like Jericho and Uruk, the manager role started to warp into something much darker. This is the shift from the big man to the chief. In many tribal societies, a big man is someone who has a lot of influence but no real power to force anyone to do anything. He has to be the most generous person in the village to keep his status. He has to throw the biggest parties and give away all his personal belongings to stay popular. If he stops being helpful or starts being greedy, people just stop listening to him and walk away. He has no way to force obedience. But a chief is something entirely different. A chief has a monopoly on violence. Once you have a city with thousands of people, you don't know everyone anymore. You've broken past Dunbar's number. You can't rely on social pressure, shaming, and gossip to keep people in line, because you don't know their names or their families. You need a system of control. The guy who was in charge of the grain silo realized he could use some of that extra food to pay a few strong, aggressive guys to stand at the door with heavy clubs. Suddenly, he's not just asking you to contribute a portion of your harvest for the good of the group. He's telling you that you have to. If you don't pay, the guys with the clubs will hurt you or take your land. If someone else tries to take the grain, the guys with the clubs will fight them off. This is the birth of the protection racket. It's the exact same logic the mafia uses today. You pay me for protection, and I'm the one you need protection from in the first place. But the first rulers were incredibly smart. They knew that ruling by fear alone is exhausting and dangerous. You have to sleep sometime, and if everyone in the city hates you, you won't last very long. They needed a way to make the people actually want to obey. They needed to make the hierarchy feel natural, like it was part of the universe itself, woven into the stars. Wait till you hear how a single bag of grain basically invented the tax man, but it wasn't just about the food, it was about the soul. This is where we see the God-King hack. If I tell you to give me half your wheat because I have a sword, you'll give it to me, but you'll hate me every second of the day. But If I tell you that the sun god will make the rain stop and the crops die unless you give me that wheat, and I'm the only one who knows the special prayers and rituals to keep the sun god happy, you'll give it to me and say thank you for saving the village. Archaeology shows us this shift happening in real time if we know where to look. Look at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. It's 11,000 years old, which is older than farming itself. It's a massive complex of stone pillars carved with wild animals and strange symbols. There are no houses there, no kitchens, just temples. This suggests that organized religion actually came before cities. We didn't get together to farm and then invent gods to explain the weather. We got together to worship something bigger than ourselves, and then we had to figure out how to feed everyone who showed up for the party. The people who ran these temples became the first elite class. They were the ones who could talk to the spirits. They were the ones who understood the movements of the stars and the timing of the seasons. In ancient Egypt, the king wasn't just a guy in charge of the government. He was the living embodiment of Ma'at, the cosmic balance of the entire universe. If the pharaoh didn't perform the right rituals at the right time, the Nile wouldn't flood, the crops would fail, and everyone would starve to death. In Mesopotamia, the kings claimed they were literally chosen by the gods to rule over the black-headed people. This is the ultimate psychological trap. If you rebel against the king, you aren't just a criminal or a political dissenter, you're a sinner. You're fighting against the fabric of reality itself. This is where the history gets a little dark and heavy. If this is flipping your perspective on civilization and how we got here, hit that like button. It really helps us keep telling these stories and digging into the truth of our past. Once the king had the grain and the gods on his side, he needed one more thing to solidify his power for the long term: a paper trail. You can't be a king if you don't know exactly how much stuff you own or how many people you can draft into your army at a moment's notice. We often think of writing as this beautiful, poetic invention for sharing stories and literature, but that's not why it was created. Writing was invented for accounting and taxes. The very first written name we have in all of human history isn't a great warrior, a wise queen, or a famous poet. It's a guy named Kushim. He lived in Sumer about 5,000 years ago. And do you know what he wrote on his clay tablet? It wasn't a poem. It was a receipt for a shipment of barley. Kushim was a bureaucrat. He was a small part of the massive machinery of the state. With writing, a king could keep track of every cow, every bushel of grain, and every peasant in his territory, even if he never met them. He could project his power across hundreds of miles without ever leaving his palace. He could issue laws, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, and have them carved in stone so they could never be changed or argued with. This was the birth of the state as we know it. It was a machine designed for turning human labor into royal power and monumental architecture. And here's the thing about this machine. Once it starts running, you can't just turn it off. This is what anthropologists call the ratchet effect. Imagine a ratchet tool. It can move forward easily, but it clicks into place and can't move backward, no matter how hard you pull. The move from hunting to farming was a ratchet. Once a population grows because of the extra food from farming, you can't just go back to hunting and gathering. There isn't enough wild game or berries left in the world to feed thousands of people living in a city. You're trapped in the system you built, whether you like it or not. And the reason we didn't just run away into the woods when things got bad? You won't believe how the geography itself trapped us in these early kingdoms. A researcher named Robert Carnero came up with the theory of caged geography. He noticed that the first great civilizations all started in places where people couldn't easily leave. In Egypt, you have the fertile Nile Valley, but it's surrounded on all sides by a brutal, empty desert. If you didn't like the pharaoh's taxes, you couldn't just move next door. You'd die of thirst within days. In Mesopotamia, you were surrounded by harsh mountains and the sea. You were stuck. When you're stuck, you have to accept the rules of whoever is in charge of the food and the water. The most terrifying part is that once the first king was invented, every other tribe on Earth eventually had to invent one too, just to survive the competition. Think about it. A tribe of 50 hunters is no match for a kingdom with a standing army of 5,000 professional soldiers who train every day. If you wanted to keep your land and your family safe, you had to organize. You had to appoint your own leaders, build your own defensive walls, and collect your own taxes to pay for your own army. Kingship was like a biological virus. It spread because the people who didn't have kings were quickly conquered or destroyed by the people who did. By about 3000 BC, the great experiment of human equality was over. The era of human freedom had ended, and the era of the subject had begun. We're about to see the point of no return, the moment where this psychological shift became so deep that people started choosing to die for their leaders without being forced. If you've stuck with me this far, you're a legend. Make sure your notifications are on for the next deep dive, because we're going into the heart of the first empires and the secrets they left behind. The most powerful evidence of this massive psychological shift can be found in the royal tombs of Ur, in what is now modern-day Iraq. When archaeologists dug into these ancient tombs, they found something that still haunts people today. They found the body of a queen named Puabi, covered in incredible gold jewelry and precious stones. But she wasn't alone in her final resting place. In the pit outside her burial chamber, they found the bodies of dozens of her servants, soldiers, and musicians. They were all lined up neatly, wearing their finest clothes, as if they were going to a party. They each had a small cup made of clay or metal next to them. It looks like they all walked down into that pit, drank a cup of poison, and lay down to die so they could continue to serve their queen in the afterlife. There were no signs of a struggle. No one was tied up or dragged there against their will. They went willingly. This is the ultimate proof of the invention of the king. In just a few thousand years, we went from a species that would kill any man who acted like a boss to a species that would commit suicide just to stay in a dead boss's shadow. We had reached a point where we valued the life of one single king or queen more than the lives of 50 regular people. We didn't find kings in the wild like we found fruit or game. We weren't born with a biological need to follow them. We built them. We built them because we needed a way to manage the chaos of living with thousands of strangers in a crowded city. We built them because we were afraid of the tribe over the hill who had their own king. We built them because we wanted someone to blame when the rain didn't fall or the river didn't flood. We traded the freedom of the small group for the security and the massive achievements of civilization. Without kings, we never would have had the pyramids, the Great Wall, or the complex irrigation systems that fed millions of people. But we also wouldn't have had world wars, systemic poverty, or the feeling of being a tiny, replaceable gear in a massive, uncaring machine. Kingship wasn't an evolutionary step up in our biology. It was a social technology, a tool. It was a tool we used to solve the problem of the food surplus and the growing population. But like any powerful tool, it ended up shaping the person who used it. We became subjects. We became taxpayers. We became soldiers. We learned to look up to the palace for answers instead of looking at each other around a campfire. Next time you look at a coin with a face on it, or watch a royal coronation on the news, remember that for most of our time on this planet, that face would have been a warning sign of a predator. Our ancestors spent 200,000 years making sure no one ever wore a crown. They knew something important that we've mostly forgotten in the modern world. They knew that power is a drug that fundamentally changes the person who drinks it. We are the only species on Earth that chooses to have a boss and follows them even when it hurts us. And while we can't go back to the Stone Age, and we probably wouldn't want to if we really saw how hard it was, it's worth asking ourselves, did we invent the king to serve us, or did the king invent us to serve him? The fences are still there. The silos are just much bigger now, made of steel and digital data. And the guys with the clubs, they've just traded them in for expensive suits and silk ties. We're still living in the world that Kushim and the first managers created 5,000 years ago. We're still trapped in the ratchet, clicking forward into a future we didn't necessarily choose. The only real difference is, now we think it's completely normal. We think this is just how humans are supposed to live, forgetting that for most of our history, we were the ones holding the rocks, making sure no one ever sat on a throne. It's a long way from the Kalahari to the boardroom, but the ghost of the big man with the club is still there, watching over the grain.